That's good.
Okay, so that's kind of us. Welcome to this kind of June 2023 meeting of the Edinburgh Civic Forum, and it's with great pleasure, actually, and I think one of the first official engagements as the new chair of the Council of the Coburn Association, if I can hand over to Barbara Cummings to kind of introduce herself to you all and take over the reins of the meeting. But before I kind of do that, I've had a few apologies, if I can just kind of note those, Barbara, going forward. But I've had apologies from Clive Preston from Stockbridge and Release Community Council, Janice Anderson from Donaldson and Area Amenity Association, Dorian Parker from PASS, I know Stephen's here from PASS, John Yellardy's from Murrayfield Community Council, Helen McBride from the Old Town Association, and Colin Preston from Fairmile Head, but I know Gillian's here in his behalf representing Fairmile Head as well, and others may come in as they go. So that's it for me, and Barbara.
Thanks, Terry, and good evening, everybody. I'm the newbie in the room, although I do know some of you, if not actually in person. I recognise some of your names, and that's not a bad thing, by the way. There's no skeletons in my closet, as it were. I've just taken over, as Terry says, as the chair of the Coburn Association from Cliff. I'm likely to be quite a different chair because I don't have the size of brain that Cliff had for a start, although apparently I have big feet to fill those big shoes. I just thought I'd start off with some of my thoughts about the year ahead, because I think it's going to be a really interesting and challenging year ahead for all of us. MPF4, as you know, is relatively new. And it's new to everybody. So it's new to all of us who have an interest in the planning system about how this will work. That's new to Scottish ministers and new to the local authority. It's the first time we've had a statutory development plan. And I think there are already lawyers out there lining up to challenge what might happen in the future. So I think it's going to be a really, well, it's going to be interesting for those of us who are happy to sit back and watch. And perhaps challenging for those in local authorities who are trying to get things through with certainty and not quite sure what that means going forward. And of course, added to that new MPF4 will be the new city plan, which I'm sure David will give us an update on where we are with that when he speaks later. So lots of new stuff, and with that comes lots of change. And we're starting to see that already through some of the secondary legislation and the guidance that's coming from Scottish Government. So at the moment, we have consultations that I think are quite interesting. One of those is what it actually means about local living in the 20-minute neighbourhood. So there's been a lot spoken about that. What does government think that actually means? How do we make that a reality? Especially, I think in somewhere like Edinburgh, it's easy for us to think of where we live as a 20-minute neighbourhood, because actually all of your community council areas, the area that I live in, they're little discrete villages within the city, as is how I like to think of them. So that's going to be an interesting one, as is effective engagement in local development plans. Now, I know city plan has already happened, but actually for future plans, are we getting the right guidance for how people should be involved in those in the future and shaping their places? Because if you don't get the big things right in the policies and the plans, then the little things that follow also won't be right. And one I'm particularly interested in seeing what happens is elected member training. There's going to be a consultation on that, and we should see that coming out soon. I very strongly think that anybody who's making decisions on planning applications should have appropriate training. It's a very responsible position, and I know a lot of councillors in Edinburgh take that responsibility seriously, and training has always been a key part of that. So it's going to be interesting to see what the Scottish Government thinks the format of training for local members should be. And it might even be a good model for training for people who want to sit on planning committees and community councils in the future. We don't know. So watch this space, that should be out soon. Other changes that are happening, of course, are permitted development rights, and we've already seen some of those coming through, relaxation in uses, in some of the infrastructure that goes with modern living, like charging for electric vehicles. And that's obviously something that Edinburgh watches closely because it has unintended consequences sometimes for our built environment. And I know conservation areas and listed buildings are protected, but actually there are very nice parts of Edinburgh that can be spoiled with inappropriate infrastructure. You don't have to be designated a conservation area to be nice, in my view. I live on a very nice street. It's not a conservation area, but I would hate to see things happen there that spoil that for me. And I know some of you will feel the same about some of the things that infrastructure providers in particular are allowed to do without the need for planning permission. And there's nothing that the council can do in respect of that. Another thing that I think that's really interesting will be the low emission zone. And there's already a split view on what that means for folk, people who find themselves living with cars that don't comply in the low emission zone. And the fact that it's happened already in Glasgow, I think means we've got the opportunity to see it tested elsewhere and what the impact of that will be. Personally, I think if our air quality is poor, we have to do something about it. So in the absence of us behaving responsibly, somebody has had to create some rules around that for us to do. So I think it's really quite an exciting time to be involved in what happens in our places. Lots of change happening. Of course, that also means there's lots of work and lots of reading for all of us as well, if you want to get involved and respond to things. And I know a lot of you give up a lot of your time to participate both in this forum and in the things that sit behind that. And that's very much appreciated by organisations like the Coburn Association. And I know it's appreciated by the council as well. We maybe don't get the opportunity to say that very often. So without further ado, let's get on to our agenda. I don't think there was anything in the minutes that needed to be specifically reported back on. There are a couple of things that folk may want to update on as we go through the meeting. So we'll kick off straight away with our update from David. Thanks, David.
Barbara, good to see you. Yeah, just a few things, just a brief update before I hand over to Daniel. So City Plan is obviously at examination at the moment. So we've started to get the requests for information coming through from the government. We've got Planning Committee next week, and we'll be putting a business bulletin out with the papers for that. And so there's a wee bit of detail in there that you can have a look at as from Thursday. But the topics that the government have been looking at are our statement of conformity. So that's how we go about our consultation and engagement in respect to the plan. They've been looking at the introduction. They've been looking at issues of mixed communities, density, sustainable design, infrastructure delivery, and sites in the southeast so far. I would expect that there'll be a lot more information requests coming from government over the coming weeks and months, which we will be answering. So our team is primed and ready for all of that, but it does generate quite a bit of work for us as we're answering all those queries. So that continues. I think we probably previously reported to you that we think it's likely, a kind of likely timescale for the examination will take us through into the early part of next year. There's no change to that thinking at the moment. That's, I think, where we think it will be. There is a potential, given that they have put, I think there's 5 reporters working on the plan at the moment. They might be able to go a little bit quicker than that. So it could happen this side of Christmas, but I think our expectation is that the plan will come through early next year, and that'll be an examination report, which the council will have to then consider and make its decision about whether or not it's going to adopt the plan. There isn't much wriggle room when that examination report comes out. We are expected to adopt it, and so we'd have to have very serious concerns for us not to do that. But we'll be looking at that when that arrives on our desks. In terms of other updates, I think since we last met, short-term let guidance, we took that to committee in April. So that guidance was approved by committee. They made a couple of little tweaks to it, which I think probably firmed it up a little bit in comparison with the proposal that we had put forward. There was a couple of fairly minor things, but that guidance was approved. So since that date, we've been using that in our planning considerations for our reports on the planning applications. I think the other thing just to highlight in terms of permitted development, again, I think since we last met, there were a few changes that came in. A couple of the key ones were around an amalgamation, or sorry, on the permitted development rights. It was the key ones in relation to the hospitality structures. So effectively, that is making seating and associated structures permitted development unless the roads authority has got a concern, if it considers that the road may be obstructed, and the road would mean not only the carriageway but the footways on either side and so on. If it was concerned, then it wouldn't be permitted development. So that does take us to a position where, from a planning perspective, there is more limited controls over the hospitality structures, but the council still retains controls in terms of its roads powers. So we're looking at that closely with our colleagues in transport, and I'll be monitoring, and no doubt they will be monitoring the situation very closely over the coming months, particularly as we get into the busier period where our footways get that bit busier in the city centre. The other thing that happened at the same time was changes to the use class order, and the use classes of shops, financial, professional and other services have been amalgamated, which means you can switch around between those. Again, we're looking at that closely to see if there are any impacts for us in Edinburgh. I think that change was designed to help support town centres that may have, greater issues in towns and town centres across Scotland. Edinburgh thrives, I think, in comparison with some other places. So again, we will look at that closely and monitor what's happening with that. And I think, as Barbara, you touched on the changes for EV charging. So again, we're looking at the implications of that, particularly in respect of the World Heritage Site. The permitted development rights don't impinge on the fact that you'll still need listed building consent if there's a change to the character of an impact on the character of the listed building. And of course, many of the buildings in the old and new town are listed buildings. So we're just exploring that a little bit at the moment, just to see if there's any impacts there. The final thing I just wanted to touch on was just in commenting on what you were talking about there, Barbara, about the legislative changes in respect of councillor training. We feel in Edinburgh we're in a fairly good position on this front, because we have effectively mandatory training for our councillors already in place, to make sure that they've got the training necessary to be able to make the development management decisions, to make the decisions when they're sitting on the local review body as well. And that's quite extensive. So what we do is, when each administration is formed, normally in the May of the year, as soon as we know who's sitting on the committee, we put them through quite an intensive training session. It used to be 2 days, but what we're doing now is 4 half days with them, and we take them through all aspects of the planning process, including explaining to them the principles of having a development plan and the guidance that might support that, talking them through the different types of applications and how they need to be dealt with, and then also the enforcement system, and giving them an understanding of that. And then what we do is we culminate with a mock development management subcommittee, so that any member that goes on to the committee that's not been on before at least has some experience of the kind of issues that they might face, the kind of pitfalls. And as part of the training as well, we give them a very good grounding in some of the legal issues around decision making, so that they understand that. And I think they emerge out of that training with a much greater depth of knowledge, I think, that they would have had they not been exposed to it. So we'll watch with interest to see what the government comes up with, but I'm well, we'll need to wait and see, but I wouldn't imagine it will vary too much from the kind of scope that we're covering, and obviously we'll adapt to whatever the government says we need to do on that front. So yeah, that's the planning update, but if there's anything that anyone wants to ask me about, obviously very happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, David, and I'm sure very reassuring for everybody who didn't know the level of training that councillors on the committees get. So there should be no excuse if you're speaking to a councillor who's on the planning committee that they don't know what they're doing. And if they don't know what they're doing, send them to David. Does anybody have any questions? Either just unmute yourself or put your hand up. Kerry.
Well, thank you, first. David, thank you for the presentation. I've got a question around the PDR and the hospitality structures within it, just to help kind of clarify it. Is you're right in the wording of it in terms of there's being a caveat about whether or not there are restrictions in the road surface or carriageway. I'm just trying to get my head around how that would actually work in an implementation phase if it's permitted developments. So is it going to be entirely reliant upon how the licensing part of the council kind of deals with it in terms of table licensing or the like? Or is it going to be how the Roads Authority applies, Section 59 of the Roads Act in its implication for how it manages congestion or the kind of use of road space? I really am struggling to figure out how it's going to work in practice.
So the permitted development right comes with a condition, and the condition is that development is permitted by this class, subject to the condition that no furniture may be placed in a public road so as to cause an obstruction unless consent has first been obtained from the relevant roads authority under Section 59. So they need to effectively get a permit, which would normally be a kind of tables and chairs permit from the council in order to put those seats in place. And in terms of the word furniture, the class goes off. The class goes on to provide an interpretation of that, and it includes not only the seating, so chairs, benches, other forms of seating, tables and so on, but also counters and stalls, umbrellas, ramps, barriers, heaters and other articles, and decking. So effectively what that means is that the kind of structures that we saw around Coburn Street, around Victoria Street, I think there's a few on the High Street as well, those would all be permitted development if the Roads Authority issues a permit. But if it doesn't issue a permit, then under Section 59, then it wouldn't be permitted development, and it would therefore require an application for planning permission, which we could then choose to grant or refuse. But if it's not going to get a permit, it would be a bit of a waste of time to apply for planning permission, because you wouldn't be able to occupy the road in any case. So it would be a bit of an expensive academic exercise, I would think. Mm-hmm. So if we look at that, I guess one of the considerations that we would have is, I'm trying to bring Zoom back up, sorry, is that the Roads Authority is principally looking at whether there is an obstruction to the road. Again, just be clear, because normally in normal parlance, the road is the carriageway, the bit that you drive on. But when we talk about roads in the council, we mean the whole shebang: footways, verges, cycleways, and carriageways. So they are looking principally at is there an obstruction? They're not looking at aesthetic issues that we might be interested in from a planning perspective, particularly when we're concerned about World Heritage Sites, conservation areas, settings of listed buildings, and so on. So we are, I think we need to just look at this carefully and see what the implications are for the city. I know that our colleagues in transport were quite concerned about some of the structures that had gone up, because not only might you have an obstruction to the kind of passage of people just moving around, like walking around the city, but there's also issues when structures go up around how the streets are maintained, being able to get access to gutters, being able to get access to drains and so on. So there's the issues that arise for the Roads Authority are sort of probably slightly wider than we might first think about. So I know that they're looking at this quite carefully at the moment as well.
Thanks, David, and thanks for the question, Terry. I've got two others with hands up. Wendy, I'll come to you next, but I think Richard beat you to it. So Richard, please.
A couple of questions, actually. One following on from the discussion that you just had. I was wondering how permitted development rights under the relaxation would relate to structures, of which there are a few examples in the new town, which sit within the curtilage of the building itself. And you mentioned for EV chargers that listed building consent would still be a requirement. I'm guessing that would still also relate to hospitality structures at the front of listed buildings, or not?
Sorry, David, you're on mute.
I'm just looking at it. I'm sorry, I'm having difficulty switching between the screen that I can see everyone on and the bit of legislation. But what it says is that a change of use a change of use of part of a public road adjacent to the relevant premises. So that would be like the cafe or the pub or restaurant or whatever. And for the purposes of selling or serving food or drink supplied from those premises or consuming good or drink, it says, that's odd, supplied from those premises, and placing furniture for use in connection with such premises. So I think that probably means that it is permitted development because of the second part, the B part there, to put structures adjacent to buildings that aren't in the footway. But I think we'd want to have a little look at that more closely and just make sure our interpretation of that is correct. But then if those structures were to affect the listed building, if it's a listed building, then we might be saying they need listed building consent. So there's an element here of the government's put in place the permitted development right, and I think we need to see what the implications of that are, because if it's out with the boundary of the road, then of course the Roads Authority's got no remit over it.
So to be continued.
Yeah, I think to be monitored carefully and just see. I think what will happen is, as tends to happen, is that the people of the city will be submitting enforcement inquiries, and I think if we're receiving those and we're saying actually there's no enforcement action to be taken here because it's permitted development, but we're looking at the structures and thinking that these are not appropriate for whatever reason, and it's out with the control of the Roads Authority, then we can consider what our next steps might be. And the next steps might be, if it was to be a significant issue, could be consideration of Article 4 directions, whereby the permitted development rights are taken away for certain areas of the city. It's quite a big step to take, given that the thrust of the legislation is to try and allow a little bit more flexibility to help support businesses. And ultimately, you know, when it's done well, it helps provide quite a bit of vibrancy and interest to streets and spaces around the city. It's just sometimes it can be, I think, it can be overdone, and it can cause concern.
And of course, it's not just happening in Edinburgh, it's happening right across Scotland. So we can watch and see what happens in other places. And I know that St Andrews was always famous for challenging things when they were new. So you never know, somewhere else that's got as strong a heritage background may equally be the first to test how far this can be pushed.
Absolutely.
Watch this space again. Stephen, did you want to come in on this, or is it on a new point?
No, it is on this, and it's what David said was that if an establishment has a tables and chairs license, then they've got permitted development for putting up structures. But if that table and chairs license probably covers operating hours, does that mean that the structures have to be removed at the end of the operating hours, or can they remain there when the premises are closed? Or do you not know that yet, or is that someone else's department, David?
That's a good question. I'd have to look into the answer to that one. That is an interesting one, because we'd have a permit to operate, and I'd need to check on that. I think traditionally what we found with the tables and chairs is that they've just been popped outside the premises on the footways, and you've maybe had those little, sometimes they're little planters on casters or little holes with kind of bits of cloth in between advertising the premises or whatever drink they're selling, and that would be it, and that can all be taken away quite easily. What we found in the COVID situation, I think it was the Scotsman Bar was the first, but they started putting up these deck structures, and we were looking at that, I suppose, in the totality, and a lot of these structures went up and took up quite a bit of space. But what we also saw on some of those same streets was tables and chairs just sitting out on the footway in a much more subtle way. So yeah, they could be taken away, and if they are being taken away every day, there's a question about whether that's even development, whether that's actually just something that you would expect to find in a street in any case, and doesn't need to be even considered permitted development because it's out with the scope of planning in the normal sense. So yeah, that's a takeaway question for me. I think I'll have to come back on that one. I'll maybe drop Terry an email once I've got to the bottom of that.
Yeah, thanks very much, David, because it's a situation that already exists at the bottom of King's Road in Portobello. And enforcement said that, yes, there was a contravention at the moment, obviously under the legislation, but that it wasn't sufficient to actually take action about. And this is a pergola that's bolted to the highway. So it's something that's going to come up, I think.
Yeah, right. Well, I'll look into that and as I say, get back to Terry.
Thanks, Stephen. Always good to stump one of our guests. Excellent. Wendy, you've been very patient. You were wanting to ask a question as well.
Well, just on a footnote about that, I think we're very concerned in the Grassmarket about the creeping tables and chairs. I mean, it used to be 8 o'clock and they all had to be inside. Then it was 9 o'clock. And now you see clusters of them sort of circled with something, and they just stay there all night. And I don't think that's acceptable. So we're very interested in that. My question is about short-term lets. I know that planning applications now have a suffix STL. But also I noticed on the last couple that I was objecting to, it was 4 weeks, not 3 weeks. Is that general?
So two things, the suffix, we put the suffix, I think it's FULSTL and CLESTL, and I think there's maybe 1 or 2 CLPSTL. So that's applications for planning permission and applications for certificate of lawful use for an existing use or for a proposed use, respectively. And that's really just to allow us to keep better track of what's going on, because the applications come forward with different kinds of descriptions. So some of them will say short stay let, some of them will say short term let, some of them might say holiday let, things like that. But by categorizing them in that way, it just allows us to keep better track of what's going on. So it's really I suppose it's an internal coding that sort of manifests itself for you all to see. But those applications, from our perspective, are just treated the exact same way as any other equivalent application for planning permission or for certificates of lawful use. So in terms of the timescales, periods for comment, those are just exactly the same. So in terms of that 3 or 4 weeks, normally it's a 3-week period, but sometimes there'll be reasons why a little bit of extra time has been added to the application, and it's always the last date for comments that is the date in which the public can make comments, and that would be the same as for any application.
Right, I was just surprised when.
Yeah, a common one would be if the application's been advertised, and then if the application comes in on a Wednesday, then the date that we go to our publishers for the advert is the following Tuesday, and then the advert doesn't go into the press until the Friday afterwards. So you can have almost a week and a half between an application coming in. It might get validated within a day or two of receipt, and then it will go immediately to neighbour notification. But then the advert can be maybe a week after that period, and that might explain. That could be one reason why there's a seemingly an additional period, but there can be other reasons.
So we can just work to 3 weeks generally.
Yeah, I would. Yeah, to be on the safe side, always try and get the comments in. But you'll see the date on the planning portal of the date. I can't remember the way it's expressed, but it's effectively the last date for public comment.
Thanks.
Okay. Thanks. I don't see any other hands. Terry?
I just wanted to know if you had any update on the judicial review of the guidance that could have put in, or whether that's all sub judice and you're going to dodge that bullet as quickly as you can.
I'm going to dodge the bullet. Yeah, all I would say on that was that there are obviously court proceedings. We were in court early in May. I think it was around the 8th or the 9th of May, and the judge said that he would provide a written judgment in due course. We don't know when that will be. It could be a number of weeks away, and I think some of the judicial reviews often take a number of months before the judgment comes through. So we'll just need to wait and see. But obviously, I can't speak about the case any further than that until we've got that decision.
Could you give any clarity on what the nature of the JR was? Because that didn't seem to be published anywhere. I couldn't quite understand what they were trying to review. Was just simply the fact that you had approved the guidance?
Well, it was principally in relation to the licensing policy that's been established. So yeah, there's so we as I say, we just need to see what the judgment says when it emerges.
Thank you.
And sorry, just on short-term lets, there is a further report on short-term lets to our planning committee on not tomorrow, but the Wednesday following. So we'd commissioned an independent analysis of economic impacts into short-term lets and a comparison between that and residential properties. So that report will be going to planning committee next week. But yeah, again, I wouldn't say anything on that until that report has been considered by committee. But yeah, you can look out for that report. It should be published this Thursday, I think.
Thanks, David, and thanks to all those who asked questions. We'll move now to the consultation, conservation and adaptation, and welcome Daniel to the meeting. He's going to take us through this. Daniel.
Thanks, everyone, and thanks for the invite. I'm not a user of Zoom, so if you just bear with me, hopefully it should come up. If I can get a thumbs up if you can see that.
Yeah, that's it there, Daniel.
Brilliant, thank you. So again, thanks for inviting me to come along and speak. By way of an introduction, my name is Daniel Lodge. I work as a planning officer covering built heritage and conservation. in the city's planning service. I work within the specialist team, which is a multidisciplinary team of professionals who support the whole placemaking and planning process through an integrated approach from local plan preparation and policy development through to planning applications, project work and training. So as part of our team, we've got professionals from architecture, biodiversity, built heritage and conservation, landscape, transport and urban design. I need to work out how to move the slide on, which is not that great. There we go. Sorry, I've gone too far. Apologies. So in this presentation, I'll aim to cover a bit of contextual stuff that closely relate to the project. These will include carbon reduction, the National Planning Framework 4 and our City Plan 2030, the cost of living crisis, climate change, and Edinburgh's designated built heritage assets. I'll then go on to outline our live conservation and adaptation consultation, some collaborative work we've been engaged with, and the second phase of the project that relates to the short-term working group, before covering the recent Scottish Government consultation on proposed development rights. So as I'm sure you're aware, Scotland is committed to some of the most ambitious carbon reduction targets in the world. The Climate Change Scotland Act 2019 has set a target for net zero emissions by the year 2045, and Edinburgh's also set an even more ambitious target for the city to be net zero by 2030. With around 40% of Scotland's total carbon emissions coming from domestic energy consumption, and almost 20% of all buildings being of traditional construction, a figure that's probably higher for Edinburgh, improving the energy efficiency of these buildings will be necessary to meet the national and city carbon reduction commitments. So alongside the revised carbon change plan and energy strategy, the recently adopted fourth National Planning Framework, NPF4, is considered a central pillar of the Scottish Government's response to the climate emergency. NPF4 places climate change and sustainability objectives at its centre, with all other policy topics a secondary and subservient tier to the principle of addressing the climate emergency. The overarching and joined-up approach set by NPF4 better reflects current understanding than the previous Scottish planning policy did, and helps provide planning authorities with a better basis to include achievable and realistic policies in their development plans. The proposed city plan aligns with NPF4 and is currently under examination by the Scottish Government. City plan aims to address the need for resilience to climate change through implementing environment policies to deal with climate change mitigation and adaptation, reduce flooding and other climate impacts as one of its overarching aims. So, increases in the cost of consumer goods underpinned by strong demand from consumers and supply chain bottlenecks have been factors causing rising inflation. Food prices have also been rising sharply over the past year. Another important driver of inflation is energy prices, with household energy tariffs and petrol cost increases. Gas prices increased to record levels after Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine and has continued to rise due to cuts in Russian supply. Electricity prices are linked to gas prices and have followed a similar trend. So Edinburgh has always experienced severe weather, and most traditional buildings were designed and built sufficiently robustly to cope with the climate. However, some buildings that have functioned perfectly well for many years may have become less able to cope with changing weather patterns caused by climate change. Often buildings have been poorly maintained or altered in such a way as to increase their vulnerability to severe weather. Maintenance and repair are the first steps to increasing resilience, but climate change presents new challenges, and some buildings may need to be adapted if they are to cope with projected changes. I know you're all aware, the City of Edinburgh contains a very high concentration of built heritage assets, with over 50 conservation areas, 2 World Heritage Sites, and the highest concentration of listed buildings outside of London. The proper conservation and management of these assets is an integral part of the wider planning function of the Council, and the Council takes its responsibilities for protection of these heritage assets very seriously and has adopted a range of initiatives for their protection. So a bit of background to the consultation. This came forward as a motion to our planning committee in November last year from in fact, the convener of the DM subcommittee, Councillor Osler. It's a bit of kind of overview of the consultation. The online survey hosted on the Council's consultation hub opened on the 31st of March and is being run for 10 weeks, closing quite closely on the Sunday the 11th of June. The survey seeks the views of the city's residents who live within listed buildings and conservation areas on the challenges of maintaining, repairing and adapting their homes in response to the climate and cost of living crisis. The survey also seeks views on the Council's current guidance for listed buildings and conservation areas, but it does not, at this stage, propose any changes to it. This will be discussed during the second phase of the project within the short-term working group. The public survey is probably better described as engagement or as a scoping consultation. At this stage, we want to fully understand and appreciate the exact nature of the issues and challenges experienced by the public before we can look at how we might address them. So in terms of the design of the survey questions have been carefully considered to help build a better understanding of the types of issues and challenges currently being experienced by homeowners. We have asked questions in relation to property type, age, designation, and EPC rating to help build an understanding of the types of buildings and areas highlighted within the responses. The identification of building defects or issues, types of interventions being undertaken or considered, and the barriers to undertaking them will help inform us of what we may need to consider in the next stage of the project. Furthermore, the questions relating to the Council's current guidance for listed buildings and conservation areas will be useful in understanding the homeowners' view of them, as will the question relating to their application experience. The second part of the survey seeks feedback on homeowners about their perception of the impact of climate change and the cost of living crisis. In order to understand how much value homeowners place on their property, we have asked them about the importance they place on a series of statements. The statements relate to the comfort of their living environment, their ability to adapt their home, the manner in which they can adapt it and the materials they use, and the preservation of its special interest. We are collaborating with the University of Edinburgh and Edinburgh World Heritage, given the similarities between our current projects. This is particularly applicable to the consultation and engagement elements, with the university basing their consultation on individual consultee interviews in connection with targeted energy retrofit projects in 5 properties, and their wider consultation interviews with 20 individual householders. The university have offered to share their analysis drawn from their individual interviews, which will strengthen and provide a more qualitative evidence base for our project. So yeah, the short-term working group was specifically sought through the motion, and it will consider the challenges identified through the consultation and set them against guidance, process and best practice currently in place for assessing energy retrofit and flood mitigation interventions to listed buildings and conservation areas. This will enable an informed appreciation of what could be done to assist the city's residents in retrofitting their homes to conserve energy and mitigate flooding without prejudicing the special interests of the city's heritage assets. It's envisaged that outcomes generated through the consultation and the short-term working group will assist in the updating of existing guidance or the production of a new guidance specifically covering energy retrofit, flood mitigation measures for listed buildings and conservation areas. However, at this stage, the project is firmly focused on fully understanding the current challenges, guidance, best practice before we explore possible changes to them. So as we've talked briefly about before, the Scottish Government's recently launched its latest consultation, phase 3. So that phase 3 really kind of dovetails in with a lot of what this project's looking to explore and covers renewable energy equipment such as ground and air source heat pumps, solar panels and windows, all within conservation areas. So similar to David's kind of input, as a council, we need to fully consider these proposals and understand better how they will impact on both our World Heritage Site, our conservation areas, and we will be responding formally to the Scottish Government on that. And I suppose as a project itself, we need to understand the impact of this and really build it into the discussions of the short-term working group. And as David also mentioned, I suppose once we understand or we begin to understand better the impact of these proposed changes, we could consider a direction under Article 4 to remove those certain classes of these new permitted development rights for some or all of our conservation areas. So I've put a link in there to the consultation. I'm quite happy to share this presentation with you afterwards. And yeah, thanks again, and put a link to our consultation. As I said, it closes shortly this Sunday. We've received in excess of 400 responses, which is reasonable. And I've also put my email address there if you want to contact me independently. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Daniel. Do you want to stop sharing your screen so we can
certainly,
see people? Thanks. No, not at all. Thanks very much. That's all very helpful. And of course, if the video is put up on YouTube, people will have access to that information anyway. Do people have any questions? Because I've got one myself. If it might not be something you can answer, Daniel. We want to treat you kindly, but all the same. One of the things that's always concerned me is that the energy performance certificate and the rating, it's a blunt instrument. Well, we all know it's a blunt instrument, and it wasn't designed for the kind of variety of buildings that we have in Edinburgh in particular. I'm just concerned about unintended consequences. And it's interesting you asking people about the comfort in their homes, because there's, you may have a perfectly comfortable living room, but it wouldn't meet the standards of an energy performance certificate. And it's whether or not we can use some of that information perhaps to continue to look for more nuance in guidance. So, my house is rubbish because it's got a low energy performance certificate. No, if your house is rubbish, it's rubbish. The energy performance certificate has got nothing to do with it. It's about energy use and comfort and how the house performs for you. And I think there's a sort of a disconnect there that's always concerned me, and it's whether or not you see some merit in using what you get from this to make sure that people aren't just doing things because they're going to get a better number. See what I mean? Yeah. I'm not explaining myself very well, but I hope you know what I mean.
Yeah, certainly. It's interesting. I know the Scottish Government is looking at the EPC rating, and I think they do understand, like you say, it's a very blunt instrument, and again, I suppose it comes down to personal preference in terms of what makes somebody feel comfortable in their home, and yeah, there is a disconnect there. I'm not quite sure if David wants to come in there.
Yeah, I was going to say, I wonder, Daniel, this is the sort of nuance that I think we probably could be getting into in the short life working group, because it's quite an interesting point, isn't it? That, and you may have spaces within your house. You might be quite content to have, you might have quite a cozy living room, but the rest of your house is quite cold. But you're okay with that. That's just how you know, whereas another person might like their whole house kind of heated all the time. And so, yeah, I think exploring that could be quite an interesting aspect to have a conversation around.
Definitely, yeah.
Harry, you've got your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Daniel. That's a really useful thing. What we'll do, just to note, is we'll try and punt this out as far as we can to bump up the numbers of the consultation to come in. One of the points we talked about this just before everybody kind of joined in the room is a lot of the thinking kind of around conservation and adaptation is around operational carbon or operational energy. And David, you'll well know in so many discussions we have in other bits, we talk a lot about embodied or embedded carbon. And so many of the historic structures in the city have already paid back their carbon debt, you know, long kind of ago, because it's of just how it's managed. And I just wonder whether there's an opportunity of actually, as what Barbara was saying about some of the nuanced things of that operational side, but of also getting some of that embedded kind of carbon taken into the equation too as well, as a long-term investment that's already been made, and the subtlety that brings into the conversation. It's a complicated thing to discuss, but it's a really important dimension of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's slightly relating as well, and I touched upon this in the presentation as well. And you know, I think we've got a long way to go with this, but the urgency is certainly there from national government, and there's a real worry that, you know, that we go through this process and we've got permitted development rights. This is probably more in connection with our listed designations, but there's a real worry that we loosen up our guidance and we get a whole host of new fabric, and considering the carbon expenditure through not just the new timber or the new materials, but the manufacturing process. So being able to understand and compare processes. I know there's been previous studies conducted by Historic Environment Scotland and looking at cost comparisons between refurbishing and replace and so forth. So I really just getting a thorough and good understanding of all these different threads that feed into that discussion, I think is really important.
Yep, thank you. John, you've got your hand up.
I don't know where to start with this. Almost. The idea is to have everything completed by 2030, and I think you've done it. It's a super report, Daniel. But I don't see any chance of that happening. We've known for years that we need to change our attitudes, cultural attitudes in buildings in Edinburgh to include double and triple glazing. We've done nothing about it. We know that we can't put air source heat pumps outside listed buildings in the new town. We've known that for years. So I think that we really have missed an opportunity here, that we should be, City of Edinburgh Council should be leading the way, saying, here's what we do, here's our plan, rather than asking the public, because this just wastes time. One of the things that concerns me here is the report seems to be about complying with guidance and how we're going to stick the rules that have been made elsewhere. And they don't have people at the centre of it, how people live in the centre of Edinburgh. Because most of our buildings in central Edinburgh are not allowing proper glazing, double and triple glazing, is so far, it just makes people live in second-rate housing compared to the rest of Europe. I'm not saying compared to other parts of Scotland. And I do hear what people are saying, my living room is good, but my rest of my house is bad. Well, why is that acceptable? And I think that we have to be much more ambitious in how we're going to do this. There's nothing here that suggests even how Edinburgh produces its own energy. If we can't have air source heat pumps outside listed buildings in the new town, well, how are we going to produce energy to heat these places? And Edinburgh needs to probably take a list and look at the public parks and saying, right, is that a source for ground source heat pumps? There is many green areas in Edinburgh that wouldn't be disrupted greatly by being harnessed to produce energy. But we're not ambitious. So I my dudes, we're going to make 2030. And I think we've got to City of Edinburgh needs to lead the way, not be asking people, your guys that are paid to do this thing, get on with it. I'm sure you prefer it that way. To go with your ambition. I'm sure you have great ambitions for this city, but I have my doubts. But a great report.
Thanks. Yeah,
to be fair to the council, there's little legitimacy to action if there isn't some sort of consultation involved in that process, because then it is just people in a darkened room making a decision for themselves. So going out to people provides legitimacy to what happens in the future then about guidance. I take your point about the speed of processes and how we should have been doing something about it now. Long before now, but I still think the council's doing the right thing by asking people what they think and how it works for them, because that will inform the process going forward. So your comment about you can't have air source heat pumps outside listed buildings in the new town, well, can't you?
I tend to agree with you.
Yeah, I know. And then what are the circumstances where you can have air source heat pumps outside listed buildings in the new town would be, and the guidance would hopefully deal with those situations. There are renewable energy provisions hidden within the new town that you're probably not aware of. So that's something that guidance can do. But Daniel, you wanted to come back on that?
Yeah, just on those. Yeah, essentially, this. You mentioned a lot of separate strands there and wider things, and of course they're all part of this commitment to become net zero. But I suppose ultimately this motion was made to the planning committee. It more than likely, although we need to look at our processes maybe in terms of applications. We need to look at how we, I would say, educate the public, but inform the public about things that they can do that wouldn't necessarily, in the current situation, require any form of consent. And yeah, consider these interventions and what we would feel is appropriate and what would not be appropriate. Historic Environment Scotland have got a very useful retrofit guide. But as a council, I think we need to be a bit more prescriptive about what's appropriate and what's not. And through this consultation and the subsequent pieces of work that we'll undertake, that's where we hope to be, so we've got more of an informed guide what might be acceptable for homeowners. And if we don't really, I suppose this consultation also covers flooding. So there's, it's not just going to be about glazing or cavity wall insulation. We need to consider all these different interventions to tackle all these impacts of climate change.
I come in on this as well, because I think there are real challenges. We've got a climate emergency. We can see some of the evidence of that, with some of the flood events and so on that have happened. The kind of heat wave last summer. So there are things that are manifesting themselves that seem to be quite strong evidence that the climate is changing, and so we are going to have to adapt to that. But we've also got this amazing built heritage. We've got a World Heritage Site. Well, we've got 2 World Heritage Sites, but if you consider the centre of Edinburgh, it's an absolutely phenomenal piece of townscape, and I think achieving some of the measures that you've just been touching on are going to have impacts. And I think part of this consultation is to kind of establish where the line of balance might be. And if you think about, one of the things we've been looking at is the issue of flooding. And if a property is flooded, you might be able to mitigate that by putting in some sort of installation around the doors of the property to, you can insert some sort of barrier to the flooding, and that would have to be, the elements of that would have to sit on the listed building permanently. That might harm its character to some degree in a small way, but previously we might have said, oh, we don't want that if we were going to take a kind of purist approach. But then on the other hand, if that building gets flooded and people can't live in that property, then its kind of role and its function and its contribution to the city is obviously massively diminished. So I think there's going to be there are kind of quite hard choices for us as a planning authority, and I think this consultation brings those choices to the fore a little bit, and hopefully it raises the debate. It hopefully helps raise our thinking, and I think Daniel kind of touched on the 400 responses we've got. That's a high level of response, so I think that's really good that we're receiving that amount of feedback, and if we receive a little bit more over the next few days, I think that's good as well. But yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting time for us just to see where this takes us, where the feedback from the working groups take us as well, and obviously we'll report back to these meetings in due course.
And of course, David, you can report in the idea of using Edinburgh's green spaces as ground source heating, so the council can be its own energy producer, and that's a great idea. So take that one away. You got that from John for free. Terry, one last point quickly, yeah.
Yeah, just quickly, I think just kind of adding this, is it's not hit this forum yet, but there was a really interesting bit of work, and I think, Daniel, you were part of the groups looking at the Climate Vulnerability Index of the World Heritage Site, but it covers the whole kind of city. And that report's just been published kind of recently, and I'm sure, John, you'd be really interested in seeing that too, where those impacts come. So what I'll try and do is source that and share it with the forum, just as some of the kind of background that comes into it. And a reminder too, on that macro level, I think, David, you were touching, is although I was kicked out of the last meeting because of some electricity cables that blew up at the top of the close, my understanding is that blue-green network presentation that Julie gave was very well received. So there's already, on a slightly more macro scale, really critically positive thinking that's kind of going on, and maybe how all this gets packaged up and joined up is a key part of maybe what the working group and the council does going forward. And there's just one final little point kind of within this, which I know from a number of experiences, we spend a lot of time talking to people, but as something to just think about is the help to give to consumers kind of on this. There's a lot of snake oil sellers kind of out there when it comes to renewable products and the like. And the more that we can all collectively help people make informed, educated choices about any adaptation or retrofit that they kind of do is well needed. So air source heat pumps are a brilliant bit of kit. There's no denying the benefit they bring. What they don't tell you when they sell it to you is the fact you're going to have to completely replumb your house because none of the plumbing is adequate to take, and that they're huge kind of consumers of electricity, and you need to have your own solar farm to power them if you want to really be net zero. So how people make these decisions kind of going forward is critical. I think that's something that we all need to kind of play a part of in our communities, of just helping that go forward. So watch the space, I think.
Thanks again, Daniel. Appreciate you taking the time to produce the presentation. I hope people found that useful and will follow up if they haven't already done so with the consultation and pass it on to anybody who would be interested in the topic. They've just got a few days, and I think there might even be rain forecast for later on in the week. So there might be a day where people don't want to be in the garden, that they'd be quite happy sitting at a computer doing a consultation. I think that's us for the core business of the meeting. We are now on to member news and issues. So I don't know, Daniel, you don't have to stay with us unless you're interested in hearing what's said. I'm sure you've got your tea to get, like the rest of us have as well. So thanks again, and you've got his contact details if you want to get in touch with Daniel about any questions that you've got too.
Thank you.
I don't know what the normal format for this is, if Cliff went round the room and asked people individually if they've got any updates, or if you simply chip in with comments and raise your hands.
Just chip in. Yep.
Yeah. So maybe Terry, if you can kick us off just with any updates from the Coburn Association, and then others can come in afterwards with issues that they want to flag up.
There's a few kind of issues that members have kind of raised, just to kind of note, if I can kind of put them out, is first of all, the Murrayfields Community Council and kind of members of it were just highlighting the kind of impact in their area as a result of the Herry for concert and all the feather boas that are kind of floating about the city. And David, this will have nothing to do with you, but there was a conversation about, can we link up actually making, the commercial operators and the private, venues, these things help pay for the public expenditure of tidying up after them. Which is kind of an issue, and there's a bit of joined up thinking about event management. And I know that tonight, for those of you who are unaware, that there's a stakeholder meeting to discuss the use of open space for events and filming going on as well. So that catches kind of in on that. I think Isabel's popped out, but there was a question within the West End Community Council, which David, you may have kind of an update on, but yet Isabel asked me to highlight the point about fixing signs onto the railings of listed buildings for the kind of east-west cycleway kind of project for going, and just how that kind of worked when neither owners were consulted or listed building consent being applied for in terms of public notices. Is my understanding was it ties into how some other kind of acts work about placing up street signage without needing to get kind of consent, but there's maybe kind of an issue that others would be interested in that as well. So those were two bits that had come in from members who weren't with us today.
Yeah, I can have a wee look into that. I think if it's temporary signage, we would take quite a relaxed approach to that, particularly where it's there for informing people. And I think within the advertisement regulations, there's powers for council to erect certain signage. The thing about it being effectively on the listed building, if it's part of the railings of the listed building, I'd have to go and check on that about what the situation is. So again, if I can just report back on that one. And but I think it is important that the council does tell the public what it's up to, because there is quite a lot of disruption caused by the construction of the cycle scheme. And I think when it comes into and I must declare an interest here, because I've been using it or the bits of it that are in place along Melville Street and alongside Donaldson's and so on. But yeah, it does have an impact, and I think people may be wondering what it is and how long it's going to be there for and so on. So, but then there's obviously a question about where that signage goes. So I'll look into that and see if I can get an answer.
Thanks for that. Any other questions from others, Terry, or is that you?
Nope, that's it for me.
Yeah. I was in the West End just yesterday. My sister lives in the West End, and there are feathers everywhere. I think there was also a little attempt for people to shame Harry Styles as well, so that perhaps he would go for something that was a much more sustainable gimmick. So I don't know what that would be, a wreath of banana skins or something. Who can say? So do we have any other issues that members want to raise, questions, news items that you want to promote?
I have, if in the kind of any other business, just one item to raise separately, and that is I've kind of forwarded you some information about a consultation, an informal consultation, I think, about amplification of music in public spaces. which the city centre project manager is quite keen to get people's kind of views on how they feel about it. So, and I've sent you a link to that consultation. So if you feel it's an issue, then I know that kind of Ian Buchanan would appreciate hearing from you.
Yes. Just call it busking, and we all know what it means. John, you had raised your hand. Oh, you're on mute. Sorry.
Sorry about that. One for David. There's a huge amount of shops have been turned into apartments at ground floor. And I'm not debating whether they should or should not, but there is an incredible, huge variation in the materials used and the design level of which these frontages have. Some of them I think are disastrous. Is there any policy, or could we commission a small competition among designers to say to anybody coming forward with an application, we can say, here, we're not against you making this into an apartment, but here are the standards you've got to conform to. Here's the half dozen templates or whatever, very high quality design. Because we're ending up with a hodgepodge. I'm thinking about the place when I go into town around Polwarth and Gilmore Place, around Dalry Road. It's a complete hodgepodge, and it looks horrible. You know, what can we do about it?
My recollection is that we do have some guidance on this. I'd need to check which part of our guidance it sits within, but I think we do have some guidance. But I think the point about making sure that the shop, what were the shop fronts, now I suppose the home fronts, the flat fronts, are attractive and sympathetic to the buildings that they're within, I think is a very important point. So if I can maybe take that away again, just if we've got the guidance, advise where that is, but it's something I think for me to feed back to our management team, just about a concern that's been raised. Of course, many of these shop fronts or former shop fronts have been done many years ago, and some of the quality of those I would agree is perhaps not what we're looking for now. I suppose what I would be more concerned about is if recent decisions have been made and they're maybe not of the quality that we would hope for. So it's, yeah, if I could take that back just for an internal discussion with our team about that as a matter that's been raised this evening.
Yeah, the Polwarth ones are on my regular bus route, and it's really quite depressing. Lack of consistency as well, because that's one of the things. You had the shop fronts, that was a consistent theme with the flat doors in between, and then you end up with half a dozen different styles of intervention. Looks odd, and yet you get runs of ones that have been done really well.
Yeah,
and you sort of think, well, why could the next again one not have been done just as well? So, but yeah, it's a personal bugbear of mine, but sometimes that's a matter of taste. Have we got any other contributions, questions, issues to raise, or is everybody needing a way to get their tea?
That must be it.
That must be it. There's nothing wrong with that, and it's still sunny outside, so we can catch a few rays safely, of course, as well. Thanks everybody for sticking with it. We'll update on how you can access the recording in due course, and issue the minutes as soon as practical. And we will see you again, or I did write this down, the 5th of September this year. So hopefully see all of you again for a rerun of that and further update on what's been happening. Enjoy your summer.
Cheers. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much.
Bye.